Hi, I'm Jessica Torres, and for 28 years, I believed my worth was measured by how invisible I could make myself at family gatherings. While my older brother Brandon got standing ovations for showing up, I got eye rolls for breathing too loud. But last month, everything changed when Mrs. Rodriguez walked up to our family barbecue and said 5 words that shattered my mother's carefully constructed narrative. "This is my landlord, Jessica." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona heat was already unbearable at 9 in the morning, but I knew the real fire would come later when I walked through those familiar gates of my childhood home on Rosewood Avenue. David handed me the sunscreen as we sat in our Honda Civic, air conditioning blasting, both of us staring at the house where I grew up feeling like a guest who overstayed her welcome. The Torres family annual barbecue wasn't just a gathering, it was a performance. Every July, my mother Patricia would transform our modest backyard into what she called a celebration of family success, complete with rented tables, catered food from Casa Grande Restaurant, and enough decorations to make a quinceañera jealous. The real purpose wasn't celebration, though. It was comparison. I watched through the windshield as my cousin Maria carried a folding chair toward the back gate, her designer purse swinging against her hip. Even from here, I could see the logo. Everything about today would be measured, evaluated, and ranked, according to my mother's unspoken but universally understood hierarchy of family achievement. David reached over and squeezed my hand. We'd been together for 3 years, and he still couldn't quite understand why I transformed into a different person whenever we visited my family. The confident woman who negotiated million-dollar commercial deals downtown became someone who apologized for existing the moment we pulled into this driveway. "You don't have to go in there," he said quietly, the same thing he'd said every year for the past 3 years. "We could drive to Sedona instead, get some coffee, watch the sunset." I shook my head, checking my reflection in the side mirror. My hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, nothing fancy. I'd learned years ago that looking too put together at family events somehow made things worse. My mother had a way of turning even success into a personal attack against her. "No, I need to do this. Besides, Mrs. Rodriguez specifically asked me to stop by today. She's been having some issues with her air conditioning unit, and I promised I'd check on it." Mrs. Rodriguez lived 3 houses down from my parents, in a small blue house with white trim that I'd purchased 18 months ago when her previous landlord tried to evict her for requesting basic repairs. She was 73, had lived in Maple Grove for 40 years, and made the best tamales in the neighborhood. She also had no idea that mentioning my name to my family would be like dropping a match in gasoline. We walked around to the backyard, David carrying the ice chest filled with sodas and my homemade salsa verde. The smell hit me first. Carne asada on the grill, my father's specialty, mixed with the scent of fresh tortillas and the faint aroma of sunscreen and chlorine from the neighbor's pool. Conversations in both English and Spanish floated across the yard, punctuated by children's laughter and the occasional sizzle from the grill. My brother Brandon spotted us first. At 31, he had the kind of effortless charm that made people forget he'd been unemployed for the better part of 2 years. His wife Michelle waved from her spot at the picnic table, where she was organizing what looked like a small mountain of presents. Brandon and Michelle had just announced their second pregnancy, and my mother had been treating it like she'd personally orchestrated the conception. "Jess, David, you made it!" Brandon's voice carried that forced enthusiasm he'd perfected over the years. He jogged over, beer in hand, and gave us both quick hugs. "Mom's been asking about you. She's got you sitting at the family table this year." The family table. I tried not to let my surprise show. For the past 5 years, David and I had been relegated to what my mother diplomatically called the young adult section, which was really just a card table set up near the fence where the Wi-Fi signal was weakest, and conversations went to die. "That's nice," I said, though my stomach clenched. Being promoted to the family table usually meant I was about to become the evening's entertainment, and not in a good way. My mother appeared as if summoned, emerging from the kitchen slider, with a platter of fresh fruit arranged in perfect rows. Patricia Torres was a small woman with an enormous presence, the kind of person who could make you feel both grateful and guilty with a single glance. She'd taught elementary school for 25 years before retiring, and she still had that teacher voice that could silence a room. "Mija," she said, setting the platter down and giving me a hug that felt more like an evaluation. She held me at arm's length afterward, her eyes scanning my outfit, khaki shorts and a simple blue blouse, with the precision of a jeweler examining a flawed diamond. "You look tired," she announced, loud enough for nearby relatives to hear. "Are you getting enough sleep? You know, working too much isn't healthy for a woman your age. Michelle was just telling me about this new vitamin complex that helps with stress." David's jaw tightened slightly. He'd witnessed these interactions enough times to recognize the pattern. My mother had perfected the art of expressing concern, in a way that felt like criticism, care that came with conditions attached. "I'm fine, Mom. Work's been busy, but good busy." I forced a smile. "The salsa's in the ice chest if you want to put it out with the other appetizers." She nodded absently, already turning to greet someone else. "Oh, and Jessica? Your father wants to talk to you later. Something about your car registration. He noticed your tags are expired." My tags weren't expired. I'd renewed them 2 months ago, and the sticker was clearly visible on my license plate. But pointing that out would only lead to a lecture about how I was being defensive and couldn't accept helpful advice from people who loved me. The afternoon unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Conversations stopped when I approached, then resumed once I'd moved on. Relatives asked David about his job at the engineering firm with genuine interest, then turned to me with polite but perfunctory questions about how things were going. Nobody asked about my work specifically, though I'd recently closed the biggest deal of my career, purchasing and renovating an entire block of rental properties that had transformed the Pine Street corridor from a collection of abandoned buildings into a thriving community. I found refuge by the beverage table, where my cousin Elena was trying to coral her 3-year-old son away from the coolers. Elena had always been one of the few family members who treated me like an actual person, rather than a cautionary tale. "Miguel, no, those are for the adults," she said, scooping him up as he reached for a beer. She turned to me with an exhausted smile. "Sometimes I think he's part monkey. How are you holding up?" "Same as always," I said, handing her a juice box from the kids' cooler. "How's the new house?" Elena's face lit up. She and her husband had recently bought their first home, a modest 3-bedroom in a newer development about 20 minutes away. "It's perfect. Well, mostly perfect. The mortgage payment is terrifying, but we're managing. I keep thinking about what you said last year about building equity instead of paying someone else's mortgage." I remembered that conversation. We'd been sitting in almost this exact spot, watching Miguel play in the kiddie pool, while Elena worried about whether they'd ever be able to afford to buy instead of rent. I'd spent an hour explaining different loan programs and first-time buyer assistance options, sketching out payment scenarios on napkins. "I'm glad it worked out," I said. "And you're right about the equity. Every payment is an investment in your future now." "Exactly. My mom thinks we're crazy for taking on the debt, but I keep telling her it's good debt. Not like credit card debt or something." Elena shifted Miguel to her other hip. "You should talk to Uncle Roberto about that. He's been complaining about his rent going up again." Uncle Roberto was my father's older brother, a mechanic who'd worked at the same shop for 15 years. He lived in a small apartment complex that had been steadily raising rents while letting the building deteriorate. I'd actually looked into the property records a few months ago and discovered the building was owned by an investment company based in California that specialized in what politely might be called aggressive rent optimization. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, though I knew Uncle Roberto would never take financial advice from his niece. In our family, age and gender trumped expertise every time. The sun climbed higher, and the backyard filled with more relatives, family friends, and neighbors. My father held court by the grill, dispensing wisdom about proper meat temperatures and life philosophy in equal measure. Robert Torres was a gentleman who spoke in metaphors and fixed things with his hands. He'd built the deck we were standing on, installed the pergola that provided shade, and maintained the garden that provided fresh vegetables for my mother's cooking. I was helping carry plates to the serving table when I heard my mother's voice rise above the general conversation. She was standing near the gate with Mrs. Johnson, one of the neighbors from 2 streets over, gesturing animatedly. "It's just so disappointing," my mother was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted everyone to listen while pretending she was having a private conversation. "You work so hard to raise your children right, to teach them values, and then they grow up and become so selfish." My hand stilled on the stack of paper plates. David appeared beside me, his face carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Some children just don't appreciate what their parents sacrificed for them," Mrs. Johnson replied, nodding sympathetically. "They get a little success and forget where they came from." "Exactly." My mother's voice grew more animated. "They think money solves everything, that they're better than the family that raised them. It's embarrassing, honestly. We're ashamed of how materialistic she's become." The conversations around us had started to quiet as people tuned into the drama. I felt David's hand touch my elbow, a silent question about whether I wanted to leave. Part of me did. The bigger part, though, was tired of running from these moments. I set the plates down on the table and turned to face my mother. "Are you talking about me, Mom?" The backyard went completely silent except for the sound of meat sizzling on the grill and children playing in the distance. My mother's eyes widened slightly, caught between embarrassment and defiance. "Jessica, I was just having a private conversation about how ashamed you are of your materialistic daughter," I finished. "In front of half the neighborhood. That doesn't sound very private." Mrs. Johnson looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Several relatives suddenly found their phones very interesting. My father had stopped flipping burgers and was watching with the expression of a man who knew he was about to witness something significant but wasn't sure if he should intervene. "You're being dramatic," my mother said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "I was simply expressing concern that you seem to care more about money than family these days." "How do I care more about money than family?" She gestured vaguely around the yard. "You barely visit, you never call, and when you do come around, all you talk about is work and investments in real estate. It's like you think you're better than us now that you have a little money." I felt something shift inside me, like a weight I'd been carrying for years suddenly redistributing itself. "A little money?" "Well, yes. You act like you're some big shot because you have a decent job." "Mom," I interrupted, my voice calmer. Then I felt. "Do you know what I do for work?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "You work downtown at an office." "Doing what?" Office work. Business things." Around us, I could see relatives exchanging glances. David had moved closer, not to rescue me, but to support whatever I was about to do. Even Miguel had stopped trying to escape his mother's arms and was watching with the solemn attention that children give to adult drama they don't understand but recognize as important. "I'm a commercial real estate investor," I said clearly. "I buy properties, renovate them, and either rent them out or sell them. Over the past 3 years, I've purchased 17 properties in Maple Grove and the surrounding neighborhoods." My mother's eyebrows drew together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 17? 17? Including the house Mrs. Rodriguez lives in, the duplex where the Morales family rents, and the 4 houses on Pine Street that used to be abandoned and are now home to young families who couldn't afford to buy anywhere else. The silence stretched longer. I could see my father watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, while Brandon looked like he was trying to solve a math problem in his head. "But you never said," my mother started. "You never asked," I replied. "In 3 years of family gatherings, you've never once asked me about my actual work. You've complained that I talk about money too much, but you've never wanted to know why financial security matters to me, or what I'm trying to build." Elena shifted Miguel again, her eyes wide. Uncle Roberto had set down his beer and was paying, attention in a way that made me think he was reevaluating something. "I grew up watching Dad stress about car repairs and you worry about grocery budgets," I continued. "I listened to both of you argue about whether we could afford new school, clothes, or if I could take piano lessons like I wanted. I decided I never wanted to have those worries, and I wanted to make sure other families didn't have to either." My mother's face had gone through several expressions: confusion, defensiveness, and something that might have been surprise. "But you never told us." "I tried to," I said. "Remember last Christmas when I wanted to explain the tax advantages of real estate investment? You said it was boring and changed the subject to Michelle's pregnancy. Remember Easter when I mentioned that I was thinking about starting a property management company? You said I was getting too big for my britches." David stepped forward slightly, not to speak, but just to remind everyone he was there, that I wasn't alone in this. "Every time I've tried to share anything about my work or my goals, I've been told I'm being materialistic, or showing off, or forgetting my roots. So I stopped trying." I looked around the yard at faces that suddenly seemed more curious than judgmental. I love this family, but I got tired of apologizing for being successful. My father finally spoke up, his voice quiet but carrying across the yard. 17 properties?" I nodded. 17 properties. 43 tenants, including Mrs. Rodriguez and 5 other neighbors you see every day. I provide affordable housing, help families build credit, and last year I donated the community room in the Pine Street building for free ESL classes. He set down his spatula and walked over, stopping a few feet away. Robert Torres was a man who expressed affection through actions rather than words, and I could see him trying to process what I'd just revealed. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked simply. "Because every time I try to talk about my work, it gets turned into a character flaw," I said. "Because success in this family seems to be something that happens to other people, not something we're supposed to achieve ourselves." The gate clicked open behind us, and Mrs. Rodriguez appeared, wearing a bright yellow dress and carrying a covered dish. She was slightly out of breath, probably from walking the 3 blocks in the heat, but she was smiling. "Patricia," she called out to my mother. "Thank you for inviting me. I brought my famous flan." She spotted me and her face lit up even brighter. "Oh, Jessica, perfect timing. I wanted everyone to meet you properly." She walked directly over to where I was standing, still holding her dish, and addressed the entire gathered family with the confidence of someone who'd been holding court in this neighborhood longer than most of us had been alive. "This is my landlord, Jessica," she announced proudly, as if she was introducing visiting royalty. "The one I've been telling you all about. She bought my house when that awful man tried to evict me, fixed everything that was broken, and charges me less rent than I was paying before. She's the reason I can still afford to live in the neighborhood where I raised my children." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the silence of people recalibrating, of assumptions being quietly dismantled. Mrs. Rodriguez continued, oblivious to the dramatic timing of her arrival. "She also owns the Martinez place next door, and the corner store on Pine Street where Maria works now. Oh, and those beautiful houses where the young families live. Jessica is the one who's been keeping our neighborhood from falling apart." She turned to me, still beaming. "I was just telling Mrs. Gutierrez from church about you yesterday, how you helped her grandson find that apartment with the affordable rent. You're like an angel, mija. taking care of the community. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from something I wasn't used to feeling at family gatherings. Pride. Mrs. Rodriguez had just painted a picture of my work that my own family had never seen, never bothered to ask about. My mother was staring at Mrs. Rodriguez like she was speaking a foreign language. Jessica owns your house? See, and thank God for that. The old landlord, he was terrible. Never fixed anything, always threatening to raise the rent. When Jessica bought the property, she came over personally to introduce herself. She said she wanted to make sure I was happy there, that I felt safe and comfortable. Who does that these days? Elena broke the silence first. Jessica, you never said you owned Mrs. Rodriguez's house. You never asked, I replied, but gently this time. None of you have ever asked about the specifics of what I do. Brandon was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Wait, so when you said you work in real estate, I meant I own real estate. I buy it, improve it, and rent it to families who need good, affordable housing. It's not just a job, it's my career, my business. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. She's very successful. All the neighbors talk about how lucky we are to have her as a landlord. She's fair, she's responsive, and she cares about the community. Not like those big companies that buy up properties and don't care about the people who live there. My father was still processing. The corner store on Pine Street? The one with the new sign? I bought it 6 months ago, I confirmed. It was going to be torn down for a parking lot. Now it's a small market that employs 3 local people and provides affordable groceries for the families in those rental houses. And the houses? He pressed. 4 houses that had been abandoned for years. I bought them from the city, renovated them completely, and now they're homes for families who were priced out of other neighborhoods. The rent I charge covers my costs and a reasonable profit, but it's about half what they'd pay in comparable housing elsewhere. Uncle Roberto stood up from his lawn chair. Are you the one who bought the old Fernandez place on Elm Street? I nodded. That's one of mine. Why? My friend Carlos lives there now with his family. He's been telling everyone about his amazing landlord who fixed the foundation problems and installed new appliances without raising his rent. That's you? That's me. The backyard had transformed from a place of judgment into something that felt like curiosity, maybe even respect. Relatives who had been making polite conversation earlier were now looking at me with genuine interest. My mother set down the empty serving dish she'd been holding and walked over to Mrs. Rodriguez. How long has Jessica been your landlord? 18 months now. Best 18 months I've had as a renter in 40 years. Mrs. Rodriguez patted my arm affectionately. She treats her tenants like family. When my water heater broke last winter, she had someone there the same day. When the air conditioning stopped working last week, she came by personally to check on me while we waited for the repairman. You came by personally? My mother asked, turning to me. Of course. Mrs. Rodriguez is in her 70s, and it was over 90 degrees. I wasn't going to let her suffer in the heat while we figured out the problem. I looked around at the faces staring at me. That's what responsible landlords do. They take care of their tenants. Elena spoke up again. When you were helping me understand the mortgage process last year, you were speaking from experience. You'd already done it multiple times. 17 times, I confirmed. Each property teaches you something new about financing, renovation, tenant relations, or neighborhood dynamics. I wanted to share what I'd learned with you because I knew it would help. My cousin Miguel had finally wriggled free from Elena's arms and was now tugging on my shorts. I looked down at him, and he held up his arms in the universal toddler gesture for pick me up. I lifted him, and he settled against my hip with the easy trust that children have for people they instinctively like. Miguel knows good people, Mrs. Rodriguez said with a laugh. Children and dogs they always know. David finally spoke, his voice warm with affection, and maybe a little pride. Jessica never talks about the personal stuff. She'll tell you about cap rates and property values all day, but she won't mention that she spent her own money to install playground equipment behind the Pine Street houses because she noticed the kids in the neighborhood didn't have anywhere safe to play. I felt my cheeks warm again. That's not a big deal. It is to those kids, he replied, and it is to their parents who don't have to worry about them playing in the street anymore. Mrs. Rodriguez clapped her hands together. I knew it. I told Mrs. Gutierrez there was something special about you. You have a good heart, mija. You're building something meaningful. My mother was very quiet, watching this interaction with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, she spoke. Jessica, why didn't you tell us about any of this? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 3 decades of family dynamics and misunderstandings. I shifted Miguel to my other hip and considered how to answer honestly without being cruel. Because every time I've tried to talk about my goals or my success, it's been treated like a character flaw, I said simply. Because in this family, ambition has always been something to be suspicious of, especially from me. That's not true, my mother started, but her voice lacked conviction. Mom, last year when I mentioned that I was thinking about expanding my business, you said I was getting greedy. When I bought my first rental property, you worried that I was taking on too much debt and should be more conservative. When I started making enough money to help with family expenses, you said it made you uncomfortable to accept money from your daughter because it wasn't natural. The relatives around us had gone quiet again, but this time it felt less like judgment and more like recognition. These were the kinds of family dynamics that most people understood intimately. I wasn't trying to discourage you, my mother said, and for the first time she sounded uncertain rather than defensive. I know you weren't trying to, I replied. But the effect was the same. I learned to keep my professional life separate from my family life because mixing them led to criticism and worry instead of support and celebration. Mrs. Rodriguez was watching this exchange with the wisdom of someone who'd raised 4 children and seen multiple generations navigate similar challenges. Patricia, she said gently. Sometimes we protect our children so much that we forget to let them soar. My father, who had been silently absorbing everything, walked back to the grill and began moving the meat around unnecessarily. It was his way of thinking through complex problems, keeping his hands busy while his mind worked. 17 properties, he said again, almost to himself. Then, louder. That's not a small business, Jessica. That's a real enterprise. It's the beginning of one, I agreed. My 5-year plan includes property management for other small landlords, maybe some commercial development projects. I want to help revitalize neighborhoods while keeping them affordable for the families who already live there. Uncle Roberto had been listening with the intense focus of someone whose rent had just increased for the 3rd time in 2 years. Are you looking for more properties? Always, I said. But I'm selective. I want properties where I can make a real difference in the community, not just generate maximum profit. He nodded slowly. My landlord is selling the building where I live. He says he wants to retire. The tenants are worried about what kind of person will buy it. What's the address? David asked, pulling out his phone to take notes. He'd become my unofficial research assistant over the years, helping me analyze potential deals and understand neighborhood dynamics. As Uncle Roberto gave him the details, I noticed that other relatives were paying attention with a different kind of interest than they'd shown earlier. Instead of polite family obligation, they seemed genuinely curious about what I did and how it might affect their own lives. My mother had moved closer to Mrs. Rodriguez and was asking quiet questions about her experience as my tenant. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught phrases like, really fixed everything, and charges fair rent. Mrs. Rodriguez was answering with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been treated well and wanted others to know about it. Elena approached with a thoughtful expression. Jessica, Can I ask you something about that financial advice you gave me last year? Of course. You said something about how real estate could be a path to generational wealth, but I didn't really understand what you meant. Could you explain it again? I settled Miguel more comfortably on my hip and looked around at the faces watching. Me. For the first time in my adult life, my family was asking me to share my expertise instead of apologizing for having it. The simple version is that when you own property, you build equity every month instead of just paying someone else's mortgage, I began. But the bigger picture is that real estate can provide income, tax advantages, and long-term appreciation that you can pass down to your children. Like an inheritance? Brandon asked, joining the conversation. Better than an inheritance, I said. An inheritance is usually a one-time transfer of wealth. Real estate can generate income for generations if it's managed properly. Your children could inherit properties that pay for their education, help them buy their own homes, or provide financial security during difficult times. My father had abandoned the grill entirely and was now listening with the focus he usually reserved for diagnosing car problems. Is that what you're building? Something to pass down? The question surprised me. I'd never thought about my parents considering my childlessness, by choice, as anything other than another disappointment. David and I had decided years ago that we wanted to focus on our careers and our relationship rather than raising children, a decision that had been met with subtle but persistent family pressure. David and I probably won't have children, I said carefully, but that doesn't mean the wealth can't help family. I could set up trusts for Miguel and any other nieces and nephews, or donate properties to community organizations. Wealth isn't just about blood relatives. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's what I'm talking about, thinking about the community, the future, not just yourself. Michelle, who had been quiet through most of this conversation, finally spoke up. Jessica, I have to ask, are you doing well financially? Like, really well? It was the kind of direct question that would have horrified my mother under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances anymore. I'm doing very well, I said honestly. Well enough that David and I could help family members if they needed it, well enough to expand the business, well enough to feel secure about the future. And you did this all yourself? She pressed. David helps with research and analysis, and I have a good relationship with a local bank that understands my business model. But yes, I started with my savings and built it from there. Brandon was looking at me with an expression that seemed to combine admiration with something that might have been regret. I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were doing okay, but I thought you just had a regular job. You never asked, I said for the third time, but without any sharpness. And to be fair, I stopped volunteering information because it seemed to make people uncomfortable. The afternoon sun was starting to shift, casting longer shadows across the backyard. Other neighbors had begun arriving for the barbecue, and I could see my father calculating whether he needed to start more meat on the grill. The normal rhythm of the party was reasserting itself, but something fundamental had changed. Mrs. Rodriguez patted my arm one more time. I need to go help in the kitchen, but thank you for everything, mija. You're a blessing to this neighborhood. As she walked away, my mother approached. She looked smaller somehow, less certain than she had earlier. Jessica, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. The conversations around us continued, but I could tell that several family members were discreetly listening. I made assumptions about your work and your priorities, she continued. I thought you were becoming materialistic and forgetting your family. I didn't realize you were building something meaningful, something that helps people. I shifted Miguel. Again, he was getting heavy and considered my response. This was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd ever received from my mother. I understand why you made those assumptions, I said finally. I wasn't very good at explaining what I was doing, and I probably did sound obsessed with money. Sometimes. But money isn't the goal, it's the tool. The goal is security, independence, and the ability to help others. She nodded, and for a moment she looked like the mother who had taught me to tie my shoes and helped me with homework, rather than the critic who had spent the afternoon expressing disappointment in my life choices. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. I should have said that earlier. Much earlier. David appeared beside us, having finished taking notes about Uncle Roberto's apartment building. "The numbers on that property look interesting," he told me quietly. 16 units, good location, reasonable asking price, might be worth a closer look. "We'll drive by tomorrow," I agreed, then turned back to my mother. "Mom, would you like to see some photos of the Pine Street project? I have before and after pictures on my phone." Her face lit up with genuine interest. "I'd love that." As I scrolled through photos of abandoned houses transformed into welcoming homes, my mother asked questions that showed she was finally seeing my work for what it really was. Not materialism or showing off, but community building and problem solving. The rest of the family gradually gathered around as I explained the renovation process, the challenges of working with the city planning department, and the satisfaction of watching families move into safe, affordable homes. Even Miguel seemed interested in the pictures, pointing at bright paint colors and asking questions in his limited vocabulary. By the time the sun began to set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized that something had shifted permanently. I was no longer the family member who apologized for taking up space. I was Jessica Torres, real estate, investor, community builder, and daughter who had finally found her voice. Mrs. Rodriguez had been right about one thing. I was building something meaningful. But it wasn't just the properties or the business success. I was building a new relationship. With my family, one based on truth instead of assumptions, respect instead of tolerance. As David and I prepared to leave, my father pulled me aside. His hands were still slightly greasy from working the grill, and he wiped them on his apron before speaking. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that your mother and I are proud of what you've accomplished. We may not have understood it before, but we understand it now." He paused, looking out over the backyard where our relatives were cleaning up plates and folding chairs. "And if you ever want to tell us more about your business, we'd like to listen. Really listen this time." I hugged him, smelling the familiar combination of aftershave and charcoal smoke that had defined my childhood. "I'd like that, Dad. I'd like that a lot." As we drove home through the quiet streets of Maple Grove, passing several of my rental properties along the way, I felt something I hadn't experienced at a family gathering in years: belonging. Not the conditional belonging that required me to be smaller, quieter, less ambitious, but the real thing. The kind that celebrates success instead of questioning it, that asks questions instead of making assumptions. David reached over and took my hand as we stopped at a red light. "So," he said with a grin, "that went better than expected." I laughed, thinking about my mother's shocked expression when Mrs. Rodriguez had introduced me as her landlord, about the genuine interest my relatives had shown in my work, about Uncle Roberto asking for advice about his housing situation. "Yeah," I agreed. It really did. Tomorrow, I would start researching Uncle Roberto's apartment building. Next week, I would show my parents the detailed business plan I'd developed for the next phase of expansion. Next month, Elena and I would have lunch to discuss real estate, investment strategies for young families. But tonight, I was simply Jessica Torres, daughter, investor, community builder, driving home with the satisfaction of finally being seen for who I really was. The weeks following the barbecue felt like living in a different family entirely. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, each message carrying the same underlying theme. They wanted to understand what I actually did for work, and more importantly, how they might benefit from it. Uncle Roberto was the first to reach out seriously. 3 days after the barbecue, he called while I was reviewing tenant applications at my downtown office. His voice carried the careful tone of someone asking for help but trying not to sound desperate. Jessica, I've been thinking about what you said regarding my building. The owner wants to sell by the end of September, and all us tenants are worried about what happens next. I pulled up the property records I'd already researched. The building was a 1960s construction, 16 units, mostly 1 and 2 bedrooms. The current owner had maintained it adequately, but hadn't invested in any major improvements in over a decade. The asking price was reasonable for the location, and the rent roll showed consistent occupancy. Have you talked to the other tenants about their concerns? I asked, making notes on the file. Everyone's scared their rent will double or they'll get evicted so the new owner can renovate and charge more. Mrs. Vasquez in 3B has lived there for 12 years. Carlos and his family just moved in last year when his wife got pregnant. Nobody can afford to move right now. This was exactly the kind of situation I'd built my business model around. Acquire properties with good bones and stable tenants, make necessary improvements without displacing existing residents, and charge fair rents that covered costs while providing reasonable returns. If I bought the building, I'd want to keep all current tenants who are paying rent on time and taking care of their units, I said. The goal would be gradual improvements that make everyone's living situation better, not displacement. The relief in his voice was audible. What would you need from us? Nothing right now. Let me run the numbers and see if the deal makes sense. If it does, I'll arrange a walkthrough and we'll go from there. David met me at the property that evening. The Paloma apartment sat on a quiet street lined with mature palm trees, the building's tan stucco exterior showing signs of age, but no serious structural issues. Uncle Roberto met us in the parking lot looking nervous but hopeful. I talked to the other tenants, he said as we walked toward the entrance. Everyone wants to meet you, but I told them to give us space for now. Mrs. Vasquez made me promise to ask if you're planning to allow pets. She's been wanting to get a small dog for companionship. I smiled. Pets are fine as long as there's a reasonable deposit and the owners are responsible. What about the current owner's pet policy? No pets allowed, which is why Mrs. Vasquez has been hesitant to get one. She doesn't want to risk eviction. As we toured the building, I could see the potential clearly. The units were spacious with good natural light, and the bones were solid. The hallways needed fresh paint, the landscaping required attention, and several units would benefit from updated appliances and fixtures. Nothing that couldn't be addressed over time with the right budget and planning. What do most tenants pay for rent? I asked as we examined the laundry room in the basement. Ranges from $850 for a 1-bedroom to $1,200 for the 2 bedrooms. Current owner hasn't raised rents in 2 years, which is part of why he wants to sell. Says he can't keep up with maintenance costs. I pulled out my phone and opened my calculator app. Based on the rent roll and my estimated improvement costs, the numbers worked. Not spectacular returns, but solid and sustainable with room for modest rent increases over time. Roberto, if I move forward with this, I want you to know that I run my properties as a business, not a charity. I expect rent paid on time, reasonable care of the units, and respectful treatment of neighbors. But I also believe in fair rents, responsive maintenance, and treating tenants like valued customers rather than necessary evils. He nodded seriously. That's all any of us want. Respect and fairness. David had been quietly taking photos and measurements throughout the tour. As we walked back to our car, he pulled out his notebook and started running calculations. Purchase. Price of $1.2 million, estimated improvements of maybe $200,000 spread over 3 years, current annual rent income of about $170,000. With a 25% down payment and current interest rates, the mortgage payment would be roughly $8,000 per month. I nodded, following his math. So we'd be looking at positive cash flow from day one, with room for modest improvements and gradual rent increases. It's not going to make us rich overnight, but it's exactly the kind of stable, community-focused investment I want to make. The next morning, I called the listing agent and scheduled a formal inspection. Word travels fast in close-knit neighborhoods, and by the time I arrived at my parents' house for Sunday dinner, the entire extended family seemed to know about my potential purchase of Uncle Roberto's building. My mother was in the kitchen when David and I arrived, stirring a pot of pozole that filled the house with the rich scent of hominy and chiles. She looked up when we entered, and her face carried an expression I was still getting used to. Genuine interest in my professional activities. "Roberto called," she said without preamble. "He says you might buy his building." "I'm considering it," I replied, washing my hands at the kitchen sink. "The numbers work, and it would let me help some family members while making a sound business investment." She nodded thoughtfully. He sounded hopeful, more hopeful than I've heard him in months. His rent keeps going up, but his wages at the shop haven't increased much. This was new territory for us, my mother expressing concern about family, financial situations, and connecting them to my work. 2 weeks earlier, she would have worried that I was taking on too much debt or getting involved in family business inappropriately. Housing costs are a real problem for working families, I agreed. That's part of why I focus on providing quality housing at fair prices rather than maximizing short-term profits. My father appeared in the doorway, still wearing his work clothes, from the auto shop. "Jessica, I wanted to ask you something about Roberto's situation. He mentioned that if you buy the building, you might allow pets." "I generally do, with appropriate deposits and screening." "Good," he said, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "Older people especially benefit from having companions. Roberto's been talking about getting a dog ever since Maria moved to California. He gets lonely." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brandon and Michelle, who came through the front door calling greetings and carrying what appeared to be several folders of paperwork. Michelle looked excited in the way that usually preceded requests for advice or assistance. "Jessica," she said, setting the folders on the counter. "Perfect timing. Brandon and I have been talking about your real estate business, and we have some questions." Over dinner, Michelle spread out the papers she'd brought. They were printouts from real estate websites, showing houses for sale in various Phoenix neighborhoods, along with handwritten notes about prices, down payment requirements, and monthly mortgage estimates. "We've been renting our house for 3 years," she explained, "and the landlord just told us he's raising the rent again next year. With the new baby coming, we're thinking it might be time to buy instead of throwing money away on rent." I looked over the listings they'd selected. Most were in newer developments on the outskirts of the city, where housing prices were somewhat lower, but commute times to downtown jobs were longer. "What's your budget looking like?" I asked, setting down my spoon. Brandon shifted uncomfortably. "That's where it gets complicated. We've got some savings, but not the 20% down that most lenders want. And my job situation has been a little unstable lately." Michelle shot him a look that suggested they'd had this conversation before. "Brandon's been doing contract work instead of full-time employment, which makes it harder to qualify for traditional mortgages." I nodded, understanding the challenge. There are loan programs designed for first-time buyers that allow smaller down payments, and some lenders are more flexible about employment situations if your income history is consistent. "That's what we were hoping you might know about," Michelle said eagerly. "You've been through the mortgage process multiple times. What should we be looking for?" David pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app. Over the years, he'd become skilled at capturing the details of these financial planning conversations, so we could follow up with specific resources and recommendations. "First thing is to get pre-approved with a lender who understands your employment situation," I began. "I can give you the name of a mortgage broker who works with self-employed borrowers and investors. She's good at finding programs that fit unusual circumstances." My father leaned forward with interest. "What about the down payment issue?" "There are several options. FHA loans require as little as 3.5% down for qualified buyers. Some state and local programs offer down payment assistance for first-time home buyers. And depending on Brandon's income and the specific property, there might be VA benefits if he has any military service, or USDA rural development loans for properties outside city limits. Brandon shook his head. No military service, and we want to stay in the Phoenix area for work. Then FHA is probably your best bet, I continued. The key is finding a property that's priced reasonably and won't require major repairs immediately. You want to buy something you can afford comfortably, not stretched to the maximum the bank will approve. Michelle had been taking notes on the back of one of her printouts. How do we know if a property is priced reasonably? Everything we've looked at seems expensive compared to what we're paying in rent. That's because you're comparing monthly rent to monthly mortgage payments, but you also need to factor in property taxes, insurance, maintenance costs, and the fact that part of each mortgage payment builds equity instead of just being an expense. David jumped in. Think of it this way. When you pay rent, 100% of that money is gone forever. When you pay a mortgage, maybe 60% goes to interest and taxes, but 40% goes toward paying down the loan principal. That 40% is essentially forced savings. My mother had been listening quietly while serving seconds of pozole to anyone who wanted them. Jessica, when you bought your first property, how did you know you were making a good decision? It was the kind of question she'd never asked before, and I could hear genuine curiosity rather than skepticism in her voice. I spent 3 months researching the neighborhood, comparing prices of similar properties, and calculating all the costs involved. I made spreadsheets showing different scenarios for rental income, vacancy rates, and maintenance expenses. And I made sure I had enough savings left over after the down payment to handle unexpected repairs. Spreadsheets, Brandon repeated with a slight grimace. I was hoping there was a simpler way to figure it out. The spreadsheets are what keep you from making expensive mistakes, I replied. Real estate is probably the largest financial decision most people will ever make. It's worth taking time to understand all the variables. Michelle looked determined. Could you show us how to make those spreadsheets? We're serious about this, but we want to do it right. Of course. We could set up a time next week to go through the process step by step. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics from home inspection contingencies to homeowners' insurance options. By the time we started clearing dishes, Michelle and Brandon had a clear action plan: get pre-approved for financing, narrow their search to properties within their confirmed budget, and learn to analyze deals objectively rather than making emotional decisions. As David and I prepared to leave, my father pulled me aside for a private conversation. We stood in the driveway under the evening sky, the air still warm from the day's heat but beginning to cool. I want to thank you for helping your brother and Michelle, he said. They need guidance, and you're the only one in the family who understands these things. It's no trouble, Dad. I'm happy to help. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the neighborhood where he'd lived for over 30 years. I've been thinking about what happened at the barbecue, about how we didn't know what you were really doing with your career. I waited, sensing he had more to say. Your mother and we grew up in families where you worked for someone else. Your whole life, saved what you could, and hoped it would be enough for retirement. The idea of owning multiple properties, of being in business for yourself, that wasn't something we understood. I know, Dad. I don't blame you for not understanding something you'd never been exposed to. But we should have asked more questions. We should have been curious instead of worried. He turned to face me directly. I'm proud of what you've built, but I'm also sorry it took us so long to see it. The apology caught me off guard. My father wasn't typically someone who expressed regret openly, preferring to show feelings through actions rather than words. Thank you for saying that, I managed. It means a lot. There's something else, he continued. Roberto told me that if you buy his building, you might need someone to help with maintenance and small repairs. I know you probably have contractors you work with, but if you ever need an extra hand, I'd be interested. I blinked, processing what he was suggesting. You want to work on my properties? I'm good with my hands, I'm reliable, and I understand the importance of taking care of tenants. Plus, it would give me a chance to see what you do from the inside, to understand your business better. The offer touched me more than I expected. My father was suggesting not just that he wanted to help, but that he wanted to learn about my work to be part of what I was building. I'd love that, I said honestly. I always need reliable people for maintenance and repairs, and having someone I trust completely would be invaluable. He smiled, the kind of satisfied expression he got when he'd solved a particularly challenging mechanical problem. Good. We'll figure out the details once you know whether the building deal goes through. The drive home gave me time to reflect on how dramatically things had changed. 3 weeks earlier, my family had seen my career as evidence of materialism and selfishness. Now they were asking for advice, offering to help, and taking genuine interest in my success. David had been unusually quiet during the drive, and as we pulled into our apartment complex, I asked what he was thinking about. Your family, he said simply. The transformation has been remarkable. Your mother asking about your decision-making process, your father offering to help with maintenance, Brandon and Michelle actually wanting to learn from your experience. It is pretty amazing, I agreed. I keep waiting for things to go back to the way they were before, but maybe they won't. Maybe they shouldn't, he replied. Maybe this is what your relationships were supposed to look like all along, once everyone stopped making assumptions about each other. The next morning brought a phone call that would test exactly how committed my family was to this new dynamic. The caller ID showed my cousin Elena's name, but when I answered, her voice was strained with stress. Jessica, I need to ask you about something, and I hope you'll be honest with me even if the answer isn't what I want to hear. Of course. What's going on? You know how we bought our house last year with your advice about the mortgage process? Yes. How's that going? The house is great, but our financial situation has changed. Miguel needs some medical treatments that our insurance only partially covers, and my husband's hours at work have been reduced. We're starting to struggle with the mortgage payments. My stomach tightened. This was every homeowner's nightmare and every advisor's fear, helping someone into a situation that later became unsustainable. How behind are you on payments? We're not behind yet, but we probably will be next month if nothing changes. I've been looking at our options, and I keep seeing ads for companies that say they can help people facing foreclosure. But I don't know if those are legitimate or scams. Most of them are scams, I said immediately. They charge upfront fees to do things you can do yourself for free, or they promise outcomes they can't deliver. Don't work with any company that asks for money up front or guarantees they can stop foreclosure. That's what I was afraid of. Jessica, I need to ask, if we can't keep up with the payments, what actually happens? I mean, what's the real timeline and process? I pulled out a notepad and started writing down key points as I talked. First, you're not in immediate danger. Mortgage companies don't want to foreclose. It's expensive and time-consuming for them. They'd rather work out a payment plan or modification that lets you keep the house. Really? Really? The first step is to call your lender as soon as you know you're going to have trouble making a payment. Explain the situation and ask about hardship options. Many lenders will temporarily reduce payments, defer some amount to the end of the CR loan, or restructure the terms to make payments more manageable. Elena's voice was already sounding less panicked. I didn't know they would work with us. I thought missing a payment meant automatic foreclosure. Not at all. Foreclosure typically doesn't start until you're at least 90 days behind, and even then there are usually opportunities to catch up or negotiate alternatives. What if the lender won't work with us, though? What if we really can't afford the house anymore? This was the harder question, but one that needed an honest answer. If you absolutely can't make the payments work, there are still options that are better than foreclosure. You could sell the house, even if you owe slightly more than it's worth in today's market. You could explore a short sale with the lender's approval, or in extreme cases, you could deed the property back to the lender voluntarily. Would any of those options let us avoid ruining our credit? They'd all affect your credit less than a completed foreclosure would. And Elena, you need to know, none of this is your fault. You made a reasonable decision based on your circumstances at the time. Medical expenses and job changes aren't things anyone can predict or control. There was a long pause before she responded. I was so worried you'd think we were irresponsible, that you'd regret helping us buy the house. Never, I said firmly. Homeownership always carries risks, and I made sure you understood that when we went through the process. The fact that you're calling for advice instead of ignoring the problem shows you're being responsible. What should I do first? Call your lender today. Explain Miguel's medical situation and your husband's reduced hours. Ask specifically about hardship forbearance options and loan modification programs. Take notes on everything they tell you, and get any agreements in writing before you sign anything. Okay. And Jessica? Would you be willing to look at our budget and see if there are other options we haven't thought of? I know you're busy, but I trust your judgment. Of course. Can you come over this weekend? Bring all your financial documents and we'll figure out the best path forward. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being the family's unofficial financial advisor. Elena's situation was a reminder that real estate success stories didn't always have happy endings, and that even good decisions could become problematic when circumstances changed unexpectedly. David found me there an hour later, still staring at the notes I'd written during the phone call. Elena? He asked, reading my expression. I explained the situation, and he listened with the careful attention he gave to any problem that might require creative solutions. It sounds like you gave her good initial advice, he said when I finished. What are you worried about? I'm worried that I'm becoming the person everyone in my family turns to when they have money problems, and that I won't always have good answers. He sat down across from me and reached for my hand. Jessica, 3 weeks ago, your family didn't even know what you did for work. Now they're asking for help because they trust your expertise and judgment. That's not a burden. It's recognition. But what if Elena loses her house? What if I give Brandon and Michelle bad advice about buying? What if Uncle Roberto's building turns out to be a mistake? Then you'll deal with those situations as they arise, the same way you've dealt with every other challenge in your business. You can't guarantee outcomes, but you can provide good information and support good decision-making. I knew he was right intellectually, but the emotional weight of family expectations felt heavier than the normal pressures of business decisions. There's something else, I admitted. I like being seen as successful and competent for the first time in my family. I'm worried that if someone has a bad outcome, they'll go back to seeing me as the person who thinks she's smarter than everyone else. David squeezed my hand. The people who have genuinely changed their opinion of you won't reverse it based on one difficult situation. And the people who would reverse it probably weren't really committed to the new perspective anyway. That afternoon, I drove out to the Paloma Apartments to conduct a more thorough inspection with my contractor, Luis Moreno. Luis had worked on several of my properties and understood my approach to renovations. Make necessary improvements without displacing existing tenants or dramatically increasing costs. Uncle Roberto met us in the parking lot again, this time accompanied by 3 other tenants who wanted to observe the inspection process. Mrs. Vasquez from 3B was a small woman in her 60s who carried herself with the dignity of someone who had worked hard her entire life. Carlos, the young father, who lived in 2A, looked nervous but hopeful. The third tenant, an older man named Frank who lived in the ground floor corner unit, seemed skeptical of the entire proceeding. I've been through this before, Frank said as we walked toward the building entrance. New owner comes in, promises. Everything will stay the same. then jacks up the rent and forces everyone out so they can renovate for higher-income tenants. I understood his concern. It was a common pattern in gentrifying neighborhoods, and longtime residents had good reason to be suspicious of new ownership. "Frank, I appreciate your directness," I said. "You're right that some investors use that strategy. I don't, for both ethical and business reasons. High tenant turnover is expensive and time-consuming. It's much more profitable to maintain good tenants and gradually improve properties over time." "How gradually?" Mrs. Vasquez asked. "My typical approach is to handle urgent repairs immediately, then spread cosmetic improvements over 2 to 3 years. Rent increases, if any, are usually modest and tied to specific improvements that benefit tenants." Luis had been examining the building exterior while we talked. "The structure looks solid," he said, pointing to various details. "Some weatherproofing issues around the windows, and the stucco needs attention in a few spots, but no major problems that I can see." As we toured the common areas and several vacant units, I explained my renovation philosophy in detail. Replace broken or inefficient systems first, then address cosmetic issues that affected livability and safety. Add amenities that tenants would value, like improved lighting or security features. Avoid expensive upgrades that would require dramatic rent increases to justify the cost. "What about the laundry room?" Carlos asked. "The machines break down constantly, and when they do work, they don't clean clothes very well." I made a note. New washers and dryers would be a priority. Reliable laundry facilities are essential, especially for families with young children. Mrs. Vasquez pointed out several other maintenance issues: a leaky faucet in the lobby restroom, inconsistent hot water in some units, and a broken security light in the parking area. Each item went on my list, with Luis providing rough cost estimates for repairs. "If you buy the building," Frank said as we finished the tour, "what happens to our leases? Do we have to sign new ones with different terms?" "Existing leases would transfer to me as the new owner," I explained. "I can't change the terms until they come up for renewal. At renewal time, I'd want to meet with each tenant individually to discuss any changes, but my goal would be to retain good tenants, not replace them." The inspection took most of the afternoon, and by the time Luis and I finished measuring and photographing everything, I had a clear picture of the property's condition and potential. The building was exactly what I'd expected: well-maintained, but tired, with good bones and systems that needed updating rather than replacement. "What do you think?" Uncle Roberto asked as we stood in the parking lot reviewing my notes. "I think it's a good investment," I said honestly. "The location is solid. The building has been well cared for and the tenant base seems stable. Luis estimates about $30,000 in immediate repairs and improvements, with another $50,000 over the next 2 years for non-urgent upgrades." "And you'd still be able to keep rents reasonable?" "The current rents are actually below market rate for comparable properties, so there's room for modest increases over time. But nothing dramatic, and nothing that would force anyone to move." Mrs. Vasquez had been listening carefully to this exchange. "Miss Torres, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Why do you care about keeping rents affordable? Wouldn't you make more money if you charged as much as possible?" It was a fair question, and one that got to the heart of my business philosophy. Short term, yes, I could probably charge higher rents. But long term, I believe affordable housing in good condition creates more stable income and stronger communities. Happy tenants take better care of properties, stay longer, and recommend the buildings to friends and family. High turnover and aggressive rent increases might generate more revenue initially, but they also create more problems and expenses. Frank nodded slowly. "That makes sense from a business perspective." "It also makes sense from a personal perspective," I continued. "I grew up in this community. I want to help preserve what makes it special: economic diversity, longtime residents, local businesses that serve working families. Gentrification that pushes out existing residents doesn't benefit anyone except developers looking for quick profits. Carlos had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now he spoke up. When would you know for sure about buying the building? I should have an answer within 2 weeks. I need to finalize financing and review all the legal documents. But assuming everything checks out, I'd like to close by the end of next month. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the complexity of what I was taking on. Buying Uncle Roberto's building wasn't just a business transaction. It was a commitment to 16 families, a neighborhood, and a way of life that was increasingly threatened by economic pressures. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment. Complex. The caller ID showed Elena's name. I called the mortgage company, she said without preamble. They have a hardship program that can reduce our payments for up to 6 months while Miguel gets his treatments. The loan officer was actually very helpful. Relief flooded through me. That's wonderful news. She also said that if our situation doesn't improve after 6 months, they have other options, including loan modification. I was so worried they'd just say we were out of luck. Most lenders really do want to work with borrowers rather than foreclose. It's good business for them, too. Jessica, I can't thank you enough for talking me through this. I was panicking, but you helped me understand that we had options. That's what family is for, I said, and realized I meant it in a way that felt different from the obligatory family support I'd grown up with. This was genuine mutual aid, based on specific skills and resources rather than just blood relation. There's one more thing, Elena continued. My husband wants to know if you'd be willing to look at some investment property with us in a few years, once our finances are more stable. He's been thinking about what you said regarding building wealth through real estate. I smiled, thinking about how far we'd all come from that awkward barbecue conversation 3 weeks earlier. I'd be happy to help when the time is right, I said. And Elena? You're going to get through this. Miguel will get the treatment he needs, your husband's work situation will improve, and you'll be stronger on the other side. I believe that now, she said. A month ago, I'm not sure I would have. After hanging up, I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the sunset paint the Phoenix sky in shades of coral and gold. Tomorrow, I would submit an offer on Uncle Roberto's building. This weekend, I would help Brandon and Michelle create their home buying budget. Next week, I would review Elena's financial situation in detail. For the first time in my adult life, being successful felt like something I could share, rather than something I had to hide. My family's problems were becoming opportunities for me to contribute meaningfully to their lives, and their questions were helping me articulate my own values and goals more clearly. David appeared at the passenger window, tapping gently to get my attention. I'd been so lost in thought that I hadn't noticed him approaching. "Everything okay?" he asked as I rolled down the window. "Everything's great," I said, and meant it, completely. I'm just taking a moment to appreciate how much has changed. Good changes? The best kind of changes. The kind that feel like they've been waiting to happen for years. The call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, jolting me awake with the kind of urgency that makes your heart race before you're fully conscious. My mother's voice was tight with stress, speaking in rapid Spanish mixed with English the way she did when she was truly upset. "Jessica, you need to come over right now. There are people here, strangers, asking questions about you and saying things that don't make sense." I sat up in bed, trying to process what she was telling me. What kind of people? What are they asking? They say they're from some housing authority or city department. They have badges and official papers. They're asking about your properties, about Uncle Roberto's building, about whether you have proper licenses. David was already reaching for his clothes, reading the alarm in my voice. I motioned for him to get dressed while I tried to get more details from my mother. "Are they inside the house?" "No, I told them to wait on the porch. But Jessica, they seem very serious, and they mentioned something about complaints being filed against you." My mind raced through possibilities. I maintained all required licenses for my rental properties, filed appropriate paperwork with the city, and had never received any violations or warnings. But I also knew that real estate investment sometimes attracted attention from neighbors or competitors who didn't understand or approve of property acquisition strategies. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't sign anything or agree to anything until I arrive." The drive to my parents' house felt endless, despite the early morning lack of traffic. David sat beside me, laptop open, researching city housing department procedures and rental property regulations while I focused on driving and trying not to panic. "According to the city website," he said, reading from his screen, "housing inspectors typically make appointments rather than showing up unannounced unless there's been a complaint about unsafe conditions or code violations." "But I haven't received any notices about complaints," I replied, taking the turn onto Rosewood Avenue faster than I should have. "All my properties are well maintained, and I respond to tenant concerns immediately. Maybe it's related to the Paloma Apartments purchase. Sometimes pending transactions trigger additional scrutiny." That possibility made sense. Large property acquisitions often involved multiple city departments reviewing licenses, zoning compliance, and building permits. But the timing seemed wrong. I hadn't even submitted a final offer yet. 3 official vehicles were parked in front of my parents' house when we arrived. 2 cars from the Phoenix Housing Department and 1 unmarked sedan that could have belonged to any number of government agencies. 4 people in business attire stood on the front porch, talking quietly among themselves while my mother watched from behind the screen door. I parked across the street and took a deep breath before getting out. Whatever this was about, I needed to handle it professionally and calmly. Losing my temper or appearing defensive would only make things worse. The apparent leader of the group was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had dealt with difficult property owners many times before. She approached as David and I walked up the driveway. "Ms. Torres, I'm Inspector Martinez from the Phoenix Housing Department. We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your rental properties." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She consulted a tablet, swiping through what appeared to be several pages of notes. "We've received multiple complaints alleging that you're operating unlicensed rental properties, charging illegal fees, and potentially violating fair housing regulations." The accusations hit me like a physical blow. Each one was serious enough to result in significant fines, legal action, or even criminal charges. And each one was completely false. "I'd like to see the specific complaints," I said. "All of my properties are properly licensed, and I follow fair housing guidelines strictly." Inspector Martinez handed me a printed summary that listed 5 separate allegations: operating rental properties without proper city licensing, charging excessive security deposits, discriminating against families with children, failing to maintain habitable conditions, and illegally entering tenant units without proper notice. As I read through the list, my confusion deepened. The complaints referenced addresses I didn't recognize, rent amounts that didn't match what I charged, and specific incidents that had never occurred. "These addresses," I said, pointing to the paper. "I don't own properties at these locations. According to our records, Torres Property Management is listed as the owner or management company for all of these addresses." David leaned over to read the document. "Torres Property Management? Jessica doesn't have a company by that name. She operates under Torres Real Estate Investments." Inspector Martinez frowned and consulted her tablet again. The complaint specifically named Torres Property Management and identified Jessica Torres as the owner. A chill ran through me as I began to understand what was happening. Someone was using my name and a similar business name to operate rental properties, and when tenants complained about poor conditions or illegal practices, those complaints were being directed to me. "Inspector Martinez," I said carefully, "I think someone is using my name fraudulently. I've never heard of Torres Property Management, and I don't own or manage properties at any of these addresses. She looked skeptical. That's a serious allegation. Do you have documentation of your actual properties and business registration? Absolutely, but it's at my office downtown. Could we arrange to meet there this afternoon so I can provide complete records? One of the other officials, a younger man with a city planning department badge, spoke up. Ma'am, we also have reports that you're in the process of purchasing a large apartment building without proper permits or tenant relocation plans. This complaint was easier to address. The Paloma Apartments on Elm Street? I haven't purchased it yet. I'm still in the due diligence phase and I haven't submitted a final offer. But you have been discussing the purchase with current tenants and making promises about rent levels and improvements? I've had preliminary conversations with tenants about my general approach to property management, but nothing has been finalized because I haven't purchased the building yet. Inspector Martinez made notes on her tablet while the other officials conferred quietly. My mother had come out onto the porch and was listening with the tense expression of someone watching her daughter face serious accusations. Ms. Torres, Inspector Martinez said finally, we're going to need you to provide comprehensive documentation of your property holdings, business licenses, and management practices. We'll also need to inspect each of your actual properties to verify their condition and compliance with city codes. I'm happy to cooperate fully, I replied. But I'd also like to file a report about identity theft and fraudulent use of my name. Someone is apparently operating rental properties under a name similar to mine and creating problems that are being attributed to me. The planning department official looked interested. Have you noticed any other signs of identity theft? Credit? Issues? Unknown financial accounts? Anything like that? Not that I'm aware of, but I haven't specifically looked for that kind of fraud. This is the first indication I've had that someone might be using my name professionally. We arranged to meet at my office that afternoon, where I would provide all documentation related to my legitimate properties and business operations. The officials also gave me contact information for the fraud division of the Phoenix Police Department, suggesting I file a report about the identity theft issue. As the government vehicles pulled away, my mother finally spoke. Mija, what is happening? Those people made it sound like you were some kind of criminal landlord. Someone is using my name to run rental properties illegally, I explained. When tenants have problems with those properties, they're complaining about me instead of the real owner. David was already on his phone, calling our attorney to explain the situation and get advice about protecting my business and reputation. While the investigation proceeded, how could someone do this? My mother asked. Don't they need official documents to rent properties? There are a lot of informal rental arrangements, especially in lower-income neighborhoods, I said. Someone could be showing properties, collecting rent and deposits, and telling tenants they're dealing with Torres Property Management without ever filing official paperwork. My father appeared from inside the house, where he'd apparently been listening from the kitchen. This is why people get suspicious of success, he said grimly. Someone sees you doing well, and they try to tear you down. The comment surprised me. 3 weeks earlier, my father might have suggested that this kind of trouble was inevitable when you got too ambitious or drew too much attention to yourself. Now he was interpreting the situation as an attack on legitimate success. We don't know if this is personal yet, I said. It might just be random identity theft or someone who chose my name because Torres is common and might fly under the radar longer. David finished his phone call and rejoined our conversation. Our attorney says this isn't uncommon with successful real estate investors. Someone sees your name in public records or business listings and decides to borrow your reputation for their own schemes. Can they stop it? My mother asked. Yes, but it takes time and documentation. Jessica needs to prove what properties she actually owns and operates. Then the city can investigate the properties she doesn't own to find the real owner. The immediate crisis was manageable, but I could see the potential for long-term damage to my reputation and business. Even if I proved my innocence completely, some people would remember that I'd been investigated for housing violations. In a business built on trust and community relationships, perception often mattered as much as reality. My phone buzzed with a text message from Uncle Roberto. "Heard there were city people at your parents' house. Everything okay with the building purchase?" News traveled fast in tight-knit neighborhoods, and I realized I needed to get ahead of rumors before they grew into something more damaging. I called Uncle Roberto immediately. "Roberto, there's been some confusion with the city about my properties, but it's not related to the Paloma Apartments purchase. Someone has been using my name fraudulently to operate other rental properties. What does that mean for us tenants?" "Nothing changes. I'm still interested in buying the building, and I'm still committed to maintaining affordable rents and treating tenants fairly. This investigation is actually going to prove that I operate legitimate, well-maintained properties." He sounded relieved. "Good. Some of the neighbors were worried that maybe you weren't what you seemed to be." After hanging up, I realized I needed to have similar conversations with all my current tenants. If city inspectors were going to visit my properties, my tenants deserved advance notice and explanation. The drive to my office gave me time to think through the implications of what was happening. Someone had invested significant effort into stealing my business identity, which suggested this wasn't random opportunism. They knew enough about my operations to use a similar business name and target the same general market of affordable rental housing. David was quiet during the drive, typing notes on his laptop about the documentation we'd need to gather for the afternoon meeting with city officials. Finally, he looked up. "Jessica, I think we need to consider that this might be connected to your family situation." "What do you mean?" "Think about the timing. 3 weeks ago, your family didn't know what you did for work. Then you had that conversation at the barbecue, word spread through the neighborhood about your success, and suddenly someone is using your name to operate rental properties illegally." The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. My business had operated quietly for years without attracting negative attention. Only recently had I become more visible in the community, and only recently had multiple people learned specific details about my property holdings. "You think someone from the neighborhood is behind this?" "I think someone learned about your success and decided to exploit it. The question is whether they're targeting you specifically or just saw an opportunity." At my office, I spent the morning gathering every document related to my property portfolio: purchase agreements, city licenses, inspection reports, tenant leases, insurance policies, and financial records. By the time Inspector Martinez arrived that afternoon, I had organized everything into clearly labeled folders that demonstrated the legitimacy and quality of my operations. The inspection took 3 hours. Inspector Martinez and her colleague reviewed every document carefully, asked detailed questions about my tenant screening process and maintenance procedures, and took notes on my business practices. Their demeanor gradually shifted from suspicious to professional to almost appreciative as they realized they were dealing with a well-run operation. "Ms. Torres," Inspector Martinez said as we finished reviewing the last folder, "your documentation is exemplary. These are some of the most complete records I've seen from a small property management operation." "Thank you. I learned early that good record-keeping protects both tenants and landlords. Based on what you've shown us today, I'm confident that the complaints we received are not related to your actual properties. We'll need to inspect your buildings to confirm their condition, but the paperwork suggests you operate exactly the kind of rental business we want to see in Phoenix." The physical inspections were scheduled for the following week, but Inspector Martinez indicated that she expected them to confirm what the documentation had already shown. I maintained quality. Properties according to all relevant codes and regulations. "What happens next with the fraudulent complaints?" I asked. "We'll investigate the properties mentioned in the original complaints to determine who actually owns and operates them. If we find evidence of fraud or identity theft, we'll refer the case to law enforcement." David had been taking notes throughout the meeting. How can Jessica protect herself if this happens again? File regular reports with the business licensing department to monitor any unauthorized use of your name. Consider registering additional variations of your business name to prevent others from using similar names, and maintain the excellent documentation you've already established. That evening, I called a family meeting at my parents' house. Brandon, Michelle, Elena, and Uncle Roberto all gathered in the living room while I explained what had happened and what I was doing to address it. So someone was pretending to be you? Elena asked. Someone was using my name and a similar business name to operate rental properties illegally. When tenants complained about poor conditions or excessive fees, those complaints got directed to me. Brandon looked concerned. Could this affect your ability to buy Uncle Roberto's building? It shouldn't, especially once the city inspections confirm that my actual properties are well maintained and properly licensed. But it's a reminder that success sometimes attracts unwanted attention. Michelle had been quiet through most of the explanation. Jessica, do you think this could be connected to someone in the family or neighborhood finding out about your business? It's possible. The timing suggests that whoever did this learned about my success recently. Uncle Roberto shifted uncomfortably. I've been telling people about your plan to buy the Paloma apartments. I hope I didn't accidentally give information to someone who would use it against you. Roberto, you didn't do anything wrong. If someone used information maliciously, that's their responsibility, not yours. My mother, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, joined the conversation. What can we do to help? The question surprised me. A month ago, my family would have seen this kind of trouble as evidence that I'd gotten too ambitious for my own good. Now they were asking how to support me through a crisis. Just continue being honest about what you know regarding my business practices. If anyone asks questions or spreads rumors, you can truthfully say that you've seen how I operate and that I treat tenants fairly. What about the building purchase? Uncle Roberto asked. Are you still planning to move forward? Absolutely. This investigation is actually going to provide official verification that I run legitimate, quality properties. That might make the purchase process smoother. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members asking thoughtful questions about business protection strategies and offering various forms of support. Elena volunteered to help, organize documentation if needed. Brandon offered to drive around checking on properties during the inspection process. Michelle suggested researching online reputation management in case negative stories appeared in local media. Their responses reinforced how much our relationships had changed. Instead of seeing my business success as something that separated me from the family, they now saw threats to my business as threats to the family's collective well-being. As David and I prepared to leave, my father asked to speak with me privately. We stood in the garage, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal that had defined his working life. Jessica, I want you to know that what happened today doesn't change how proud I am of what you've built. Thank you, Dad. That means a lot. I also want you to know that if this gets worse, if you need help dealing with lawyers or investigators, or anyone else, you don't have to handle it alone. The offer touched me deeply. My father was suggesting that the family would rally around me during professional difficulties, treating my business challenges as family challenges rather than individual problems I'd brought on myself. I appreciate that more than you know, I said. Good, because you're not just Jessica who happens to be successful anymore. You're Jessica whose success makes the whole family stronger. The drive home was quiet as David and I both processed the day's events. The immediate crisis was manageable, and the investigation would likely clear my name completely. But the experience had highlighted both the risks and rewards of my new visibility in the community. How are you feeling about everything? David asked as we pulled into our apartment complex. Oddly positive, I realized. 6 months ago, this kind of problem would have sent me into hiding. I would have worried that I'd drawn too much attention to myself and tried to become invisible again, And now? Now I have a family that asks how they can help instead of suggesting I brought it on myself. I have documentation that proves I run an ethical business. And I have city officials who were impressed with my operations rather than suspicious of them. David smiled. So the person who tried to damage your reputation might have accidentally strengthened it instead. Exactly. Sometimes the best response to false accusations is transparent honesty about what you're really doing. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the strange trajectory my life had taken over the past month. A family barbecue conversation had led to new respect from relatives. That respect had led to increased visibility in the community. The visibility had attracted both legitimate opportunities and fraudulent exploitation. And dealing with the fraud was forcing me to document and defend business practices that were actually exemplary. Each challenge had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed and support systems I hadn't expected to find. The person trying to steal my identity had inadvertently created opportunities for me to prove my integrity publicly and build stronger relationships with both my family and my community. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Rodriguez. Heard you had some trouble today. Want you to know that all the neighbors on our street think you're wonderful. If anyone asks, we'll tell them the truth about what kind of landlord you are. I smiled, thinking about how many similar messages I'd probably receive over the next few days, as word spread through the neighborhood about the investigation. The same community connections that had made me vulnerable to fraud were also providing protection against false accusations. The fraudulent Torres property management might have borrowed my name, but they couldn't borrow my reputation, my relationships, or my track record of treating people fairly. Those things had to be earned over time through consistent actions, and they couldn't be stolen by someone looking for quick profits at others' expense. Tomorrow, I would continue cooperating with the city investigation, preparing for property, inspections, and managing my legitimate business operations. But tonight, I felt more confident than ever that the foundation I'd built over the past 3 years was solid enough to withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. The person who had tried to exploit my success had miscalculated in one crucial way. They'd assumed that being named Jessica Torres was enough to access what I'd built. But what I'd really built wasn't just a collection of properties or a business reputation. It was a network of relationships based on trust, fairness, and mutual respect. That network was now rallying to protect both my business and my character, proving that genuine success creates its own defenses against those who would try to tear it down. The property inspections began on a humid Thursday morning in early September. Inspector Martinez arrived at my first building on Pine Street, accompanied by a fire safety specialist and a structural engineer, their clipboards and measuring devices, suggesting this would be thorough rather than perfunctory. I'd spent the previous evening walking through each property with Luis, my contractor, making sure everything was in perfect condition. Not because I was hiding problems, but because I wanted the inspectors to see my buildings at their absolute best. These inspections would become part of the official record, and I needed them to reflect the quality and care I put into maintaining my properties. Mrs. Chen, who lived in Unit 2B with her elderly mother, met us at the front entrance. She'd been my tenant for over 2 years and had volunteered to show the inspectors her apartment when I'd explained the situation to all my tenants earlier in the week. "Good morning, Jessica," she said warmly, then turned to the inspectors. "I hope you'll see what a wonderful landlord she is." When my mother fell and needed grab bars installed in the bathroom, Jessica had them up within 2 days. No charge, just because it was the right thing to do. Inspector Martinez made a note, but her expression remained professional. "We'll need to see the work permits for any modifications like that." I pulled the appropriate documents from my folder. All accessibility modifications are done with proper permits and licensed contractors. I keep copies of everything. The inspection took 3 hours. They tested smoke detectors, examined electrical panels, checked plumbing fixtures, and measured room dimensions to verify occupancy limits. They looked at my maintenance request system, reviewed tenant communications, and asked detailed questions about my emergency response procedures. In Mrs. Chen's unit, the fire safety specialist was particularly impressed with the new smoke detection system I'd installed throughout the building. These are commercial-grade units with battery backup and wireless monitoring. That's above and beyond residential requirements. Safety is worth the extra investment, I replied. Most of my tenants are families with children or elderly residents. I want them to feel completely secure. The structural engineer found minor issues that needed attention. A small crack in the foundation that should be monitored, some weatherproofing, around windows that needed refreshing, but nothing that suggested neglect or code violations. Overall condition is excellent, he told Inspector Martinez as we finished the walkthrough. This property is better maintained than most apartment buildings I inspect. The pattern repeated at each of my properties over the following 3 days. Tenants eagerly spoke with inspectors about responsive maintenance, fair treatment, and the improvements I'd made to their living situations. The official findings consistently showed buildings that exceeded minimum safety and habitability standards. On Friday afternoon, Inspector Martinez called to schedule a final meeting at my office. Her tone was noticeably different from our first conversation, warmer, more collegial. Ms. Torres, I wanted to discuss our findings and let you know where things stand with the investigation. David and I arrived at the city building early, both nervous about what we might learn. Had they identified the real Torres Property Management? Was my name fully cleared? Would there be any ongoing restrictions on my business operations? Inspector Martinez greeted us in a conference room overlooking downtown Phoenix. She was accompanied by Detective Sarah Williams from the Fraud Division of the Phoenix Police Department, whose presence suggested the investigation had expanded beyond simple housing code violations. Let me start with the good news, Inspector Martinez began. Your properties are exemplary. In 15 years of housing inspections, I've rarely seen such consistent quality and attention to detail. Your maintenance records are thorough, your tenant relationships are positive, and your buildings exceed safety requirements in most categories. Relief flooded through me, but I could tell there was more to come. Detective Williams opened her own folder. We've also made significant progress identifying the actual Torres property management operation. It turns out you're not the only victim of this fraud. She spread several photographs across the table showing run-down apartment buildings and houses with obvious code violations. These are the properties that generated the original complaints against you. They're owned by a man named Marcus Torres, no relation to you, who's been operating rental properties under multiple business names throughout Phoenix. Multiple business names? David asked. Torres Property Management? Desert Rental. Solutions, Phoenix Housing Partners. He creates a new company name every time complaints start piling up against the previous one. When tenants search for contact information to file complaints, they often find legitimate businesses with similar names instead of his actual operation. I studied the photographs, recognizing none of the locations. The buildings showed clear signs of neglect, broken windows, damaged roofing, overgrown landscaping, and security hazards that no responsible landlord would ignore. How long has he been doing this? I asked. At least 3 years that we can document, Detective Williams replied. Possibly longer. He targets low-income neighborhoods where tenants may not know their rights or may be afraid to complain to authorities. Inspector Martinez pulled out another folder. We've identified at least 12 other property owners whose names or business identities he's borrowed over the years. The pattern is always the same. He finds successful landlords with good reputations and creates similar business names to benefit from their credibility. What happens now? David asked. We're building a case for identity theft, fraud, and multiple housing code violations. Mr. Torres will face both criminal charges and civil penalties. As for you, Ms. Torres, your name is completely cleared, and we'll be issuing a letter documenting that you were the victim of identity theft, rather than the perpetrator of any violations. The news was better than I'd dared to hope. Not only was my reputation intact, but the investigation had uncovered a systematic fraud that would protect other legitimate property owners from similar exploitation. "There's one more thing," Detective Williams added. "We'd like you to consider joining a task force we're forming to combat rental property fraud in Phoenix. Your experience as both a victim and a responsible property owner could help us develop better protection systems." My invitation was unexpected but appealing. After spending a week defending my reputation, the opportunity to help prevent similar problems for others felt like a meaningful way to turn a negative experience into something constructive. "I'd be interested in learning more about that," I said. As we left the city building, David was practically bouncing with relief and excitement. "Not only are you cleared, but they want you to help them fix the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." "It's strange how things work out," I agreed. "A week ago, I thought this investigation might ruin my business. Now it's led to official recognition that I operate exactly the kind of rental business the city wants to encourage." My phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the meeting. Word had apparently spread that the inspections were complete, and family, members, tenants, and neighbors were eager to hear the results. I called Uncle Roberto first. "The investigation is over, and everything came back clean. The city confirmed that I run quality properties and treat tenants fairly." "That's wonderful news. Does this mean the Paloma Apartments purchase can move forward?" "Absolutely. In fact, the investigation might make the process smoother. I now have official documentation from the city that my properties exceed safety and maintenance standards." "Jessica, I can't tell you how relieved everyone is. We were worried that maybe we'd never find a good landlord for our building." The relief in his voice reminded me how much stress my tenants and potential tenants had experienced during the investigation. They'd been depending on me to provide stable, affordable housing, and the fraud investigation had threatened that. Security. My next call was to Mrs. Rodriguez, who answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Mija, thank goodness! Mrs. Gutierrez was so worried that maybe you were in some kind of trouble." "No trouble at all. The city confirmed that I maintain my properties properly and treat tenants well. The problems they investigated were caused by someone else using my name illegally. I told everyone that couldn't be right. We know what kind of person you are. We see how you take care of your buildings and your tenants." Her unwavering confidence in my character meant more than any official vindication. Mrs. Rodriguez and my other tenants had never doubted my integrity, even when government investigators were asking questions about rental violations and illegal business practices. That evening, my parents hosted an impromptu celebration dinner. My entire extended family gathered in their backyard, where Uncle Roberto regaled everyone with details about the property inspections and the investigation's positive outcome. The fire safety inspector said Jessica's smoke detection system was the best he'd seen in a residential building, he announced to the assembled relatives, and the structural engineer couldn't find anything wrong with the maintenance or upkeep. Elena raised her glass of lemonade. "To Jessica, for showing us that success doesn't have to come at other people's expense." The toast was echoed around the table, but what struck me most was the natural way my family now discussed my business achievements. 3 months earlier, talk of my professional success would have been met with uncomfortable silence or subtle suggestions that I was bragging. Now my relatives asked informed questions about property management, shared stories about their own interactions with landlords, and offered genuine congratulations on overcoming the investigation. Brandon pulled me aside as we were cleaning up after dinner. "Jessica, I wanted to ask you about something, but I wasn't sure if this was a good time with everything that's been happening." "What's on your mind?" "Michelle and I have been looking at houses like you suggested, and we found one we really like, but the seller is asking for a quick closing, and we're not sure if we can get everything done in time." I'd been helping them navigate the home buying process for several weeks, reviewing properties and explaining financing options. Their situation was complicated by Brandon's irregular employment history, but we'd identified several loan programs that could work for their circumstances. How quick is quick? 30 days. The seller got a job transfer and needs to move fast. They're willing to accept a lower offer in exchange for a guaranteed closing date. That's definitely doable if you're pre-approved and the property inspection goes smoothly. Have you talked to the mortgage broker I recommended? We have an appointment with her next week. But Jessica, there's something else. The down payment is going to use up most of our savings, and we're worried about having enough money left for moving expenses and immediate repairs. I could see where this conversation was heading, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Lending money to family members could complicate relationships, especially when the borrowers were still figuring out their financial stability. What kind of amount are you thinking about? Maybe $5,000? Just to cover moving costs and any small repairs that come up in the first few months. We could pay you back over time, with interest if you want. David had been listening from a few feet away, and he caught my eye. We'd discussed this possibility when Brandon and Michelle first started house hunting. I could afford to help them, and a successful home purchase would be good for their financial future, but family loans carried emotional risks that pure business transactions didn't. Let me think about it, I said. I want to help you guys succeed, but I also want to make sure we structure any loan in a way that protects our relationship. Of course, and Jessica, if you're not comfortable with it, we understand. You've already helped us so much just by explaining the process and connecting us with the right professionals. The conversation highlighted how much my role in the family had evolved. I'd gone from being the overlooked daughter to being seen as a resource for financial advice and assistance. The transformation was gratifying, but it also created new responsibilities and potential complications. Michelle joined us, having finished helping my mother pack up leftover food. Are you talking about the house loan? Jessica's considering it, Brandon replied. Whatever you decide is fine with us, Michelle said. But I wanted you to know that this isn't just about the money. Having someone in the family who understands real estate and mortgages has made this whole process so much less scary. What do you mean? Before you started helping us, buying a house felt impossible, like something other people did, but not people like us. You've shown us that homeownership is achievable if you understand the process and make smart decisions. The comment reminded me of my own journey into real estate investment. I'd started with similar feelings of intimidation and uncertainty, wondering if property ownership was something I could really achieve. Having family support during those early stages would have made the process much easier. Let me propose something, I said. Instead of a traditional loan, what if I help you with the down payment as a gift, with the understanding that you'll pay it forward by helping other family members when they're ready to buy homes? Brandon and Michelle exchanged glances. You mean like an investment in the family's overall financial future? Michelle asked. Exactly. Elena and her husband will probably want to move to a bigger house in a few years. Maybe some of the younger cousins will be ready to buy their first homes. Instead of paying me back directly, you help them navigate the process when their time comes. The idea appealed to me because it addressed my concerns about family financial dynamics while supporting the broader goal of building generational wealth within our extended family. Individual success was important, but collective advancement was even more powerful. I love that idea, Michelle said. It's like creating a family investment circle. Something like that. And if you run into financial trouble with the house, you come to me for advice before things get serious. No hiding problems until they become crises. We spent the next hour working out details of the arrangement. I would provide a gift of $5,000 for closing costs and immediate repairs. They would document their home buying experience to help future family purchasers, and they would commit to providing similar assistance to relatives when they were financially able. As David and I drove home that night, he was quiet for several miles before speaking. "That was brilliant, what you did with Brandon and Michelle." "The gift arrangement?" "The way you turned a potentially complicated family loan into an investment in family financial literacy. You're not just helping them buy a house, you're teaching them to be resources for other family members." I'd been thinking along similar lines. The arrangement felt more sustainable than traditional family lending because it created ongoing relationships rather than simple debtor-creditor dynamics. "I keep thinking about how different this could have been," I said. 6 months ago, if Brandon had asked me for money, I probably would have said no because I was tired of being seen as the family bank account. Now I can help them because it feels like we're building something together rather than me just solving their problem. What changed? They see me as a person with valuable expertise, not just someone with money to spare. And I see them as people who are genuinely trying to improve their financial situation, not just looking for easy solutions. The mutual respect had made all the difference. Instead of feeling used or resentful, I felt excited about contributing to family members' success in meaningful ways. My phone rang as we pulled into our apartment complex. The caller ID showed Inspector Martinez's number, which was unexpected given the late hour. "Ms. Torres, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to give you an update on the Torres property. Management investigation." "Of course. What's happening?" "We arrested Marcus Torres this afternoon. He's being charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and housing code violations. The district attorney is also pursuing civil penalties that could result in significant financial restitution for affected tenants." The news was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. For the past week, I'd been focused on clearing my own name and protecting my business. Learning that the person responsible for the fraud was facing serious consequences felt like justice for all the tenants who had suffered in his poorly maintained properties. What about the tenants in his buildings? That's actually why I'm calling. The city is working with several nonprofit organizations to help them find alternative housing. We're also reaching out to responsible landlords who might have suitable units available. I understood the implied question. "How many families are we talking about?" "About 40 units across 6 buildings. Mix of families, elderly residents, and single adults. Most are paying rent in the $600 to $900 range. I didn't have 40 vacant units, but I knew other landlords who shared my philosophy of providing quality, affordable housing. The situation also represented an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of collaborative community response that could help tenants while supporting responsible property owners. "Let me make some calls," I said. "I know several other property owners who might be able to help, and I have a few units that will be available next month." "That would be incredibly helpful. I'll email you the contact information for the nonprofit organizations coordinating the relocation assistance." After hanging up, I sat in the car for a few minutes thinking about the strange journey the past month had taken. A family barbecue conversation had led to new respect from relatives, which had led to increased community visibility, which had attracted fraudulent exploitation, which had resulted in official recognition of my business practices, which was now creating opportunities to help displaced tenants find better housing. Each step had built on the previous one in ways I couldn't have predicted or planned. The attempt to damage my reputation had instead strengthened my relationships with family, tenants, and city officials. The investigation that had threatened my business had become a platform for expanding my positive impact in the community. David had been watching me think. "You're going to help relocate those tenants, aren't you?" "Some of them, probably. And I'm going to talk to other landlords about helping with the rest." "Even though it means more work and complications for you?" "Especially because of that. These tenants were victimized by someone who stole my identity to hurt them. I have a responsibility to help fix the damage, even though I didn't cause it." The responsibility felt both moral and practical. Marcus Torres had used my name to exploit vulnerable tenants, damaging both their living situations and my reputation. Helping them find better housing would address the harm he'd caused while demonstrating the values I wanted my business to represent. Besides, I added, this is exactly the kind of situation where ethical landlords need to work together. If we can't provide alternatives when bad operators get shut down, tenants suffer and the whole rental market gets a worse reputation. As we finally headed upstairs to our apartment, I was already mentally organizing the calls I'd need to make the next day. Contact other property owners, review my upcoming vacancies, research the nonprofit organizations handling tenant relocation. The work would be substantial, but it felt like the natural next step in a month that had transformed my understanding of what success really meant. True success wasn't just about individual achievement or financial gain. It was about building systems that created opportunities for others, establishing relationships based on mutual respect and support, and using whatever influence you'd gained to address problems in your community. A month ago, I'd thought success meant being financially secure enough to avoid family obligations and expectations. Now, I understood that real success meant being connected enough to family and community that you could contribute meaningfully to their well-being while still maintaining your own integrity and goals. The fraudulent Torres property management had tried to exploit that success, but had instead revealed its true foundation. Not just money or property, but trust, relationships, and the commitment to use both responsibly. 3 months later, I stood in the community room of the Paloma Apartments, watching as Mrs. Vasquez carefully signed her new lease agreement. The small dog she'd wanted for years sat patiently at her feet, a brown and white terrier mix named Coco who had already become the building's unofficial mascot. "I still can't believe pets are allowed now," she said, reaching down to scratch behind Coco's ears. "When Mr. Henderson owned the building, he acted like having a goldfish was a crime." Uncle Roberto laughed from his spot near the window, where he was installing new blinds with my father's help. The two men had developed an easy working relationship over the past few months, with Dad providing maintenance expertise and Roberto serving as the informal liaison between management and tenants. "Oh, Jessica keeps her promises," Roberto said, adjusting the mounting bracket. "She said she'd allow pets with reasonable deposits, and here we are." The purchase of the Paloma Apartments had closed 6 weeks earlier, exactly on schedule despite the complications from the identity theft investigation. If anything, the city's official documentation of my property management practices had streamlined the approval process, with the building inspector noting that he expected the new ownership to significantly improve the building's condition and tenant satisfaction. I was reviewing Mrs. Vasquez's lease terms when my phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Moving day went perfectly. Miguel loves his new room. Can't wait to show you the house tonight." Elena and her husband had successfully sold their original home and purchased a larger property in a neighborhood with better schools, using the equity they'd built as a down payment and applying the financial planning principles we'd discussed during her mortgage crisis. Their story had become a family success template, proving that temporary setbacks could be overcome with proper planning and support. "Ms. Torres," said Carlos, approaching with his wife and young daughter in tow. "We wanted to thank you again for keeping our rent the same when you took over. Other landlords in the neighborhood have been raising rents by $200 or $300. Your family has been here for over a year. You take excellent care of your unit, and you pay rent." "On time," I replied. "Why would I want you to move?" His wife, Maria, shifted their toddler to her other hip. "Because you could make more money?" "I could make more money in the short term, but I'd also have turnover costs, vacancy periods, and the risk of getting tenants who don't care for the property as well as you do. Keeping good tenants is better business than chasing maximum rents." This conversation had become routine since I'd taken ownership of the building. Tenants who had lived with uncertainty under the previous owner were still adjusting to the idea that responsive maintenance and stable rent increases were normal rather than special favors. David appeared in the doorway carrying a box of new smoke detectors. Over the past 3 months, he'd become increasingly involved in the day-to-day operations of my properties, trading his weekend engineering consulting work for hands-on experience in real estate management. The electrician finished installing the upgraded panels, he reported. All 16 units now have individual circuit breakers and GFCI protection in the bathrooms and kitchens. Frank, the skeptical tenant who had questioned my motives during the initial inspection, looked up from the newspaper he'd been reading in the corner. How much is this electrical work going to add to our rent? It was a fair question from someone who'd learned to expect that improvements meant immediate cost increases for tenants. Nothing this year, I said. The electrical upgrades were necessary for safety and code compliance. I factor those costs into my operating budget rather than passing them directly to tenants. Frank nodded slowly. 3 months of consistent actions had gradually overcome his initial distrust, though he still approached every interaction with the careful wariness of someone who'd been disappointed by landlords before. My phone rang with a call from Detective Williams. The Marcus Torres case had been moving through the courts, and she occasionally updated me on developments that might affect my business or the displaced tenants we'd helped relocate. Ms. Torres, I wanted to give you some good news. Marcus Torres pled guilty to all charges yesterday. He's going to serve 18 months in prison and pay restitution to the tenants who were overcharged or lived in substandard conditions. What about the buildings he owned? The city condemned 3 of them as uninhabitable. The other 3 are being sold to pay restitution and fines. We're working with the same nonprofit organizations to make sure any remaining tenants have adequate notice and relocation assistance. The resolution felt appropriate. Marcus Torres would face consequences for exploiting vulnerable tenants. The worst buildings would be removed from the rental market entirely, and displaced residents would receive support finding better housing. There's one more thing, Detective Williams continued. The task force on rental property fraud that we discussed is moving forward. The City Council approved funding for additional inspectors and a public database that will let tenants verify landlord identities and check property ownership records. That sounds like it could help a lot of people. We hope so, and we'd still like you to serve on the advisory committee if you're interested. Your experience from both sides of the issue would be valuable. I'd been considering the invitation for months, weighing the time commitment against the opportunity to help prevent other property owners from experiencing identity theft and to help tenants avoid exploitative rental situations. I'd be honored to participate, I said. After hanging up, I looked around the community room that had become an informal family gathering space over the past few months. Uncle Roberto and my father were discussing the merits of different paint finishes for the hallway refresh we'd planned for next month. Mrs. Vasquez was showing photos of Coco to Carlos's daughter, who was lobbying her parents for a pet of her own. This was what I'd been trying to build without fully understanding it. Not just a real estate portfolio, but a community where people felt secure, respected, and connected to each other. The business success was important, but the relationships and sense of belonging were the real measures of achievement. Michelle burst through the door with the energy of someone carrying exciting news. She and Brandon had officially closed on their house the previous week, and she'd been practically glowing with pride ever since. Jessica, perfect timing. I brought the photos of our house to show everyone. She spread pictures across the table, showing a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a small yard and mature trees. Nothing fancy, but clearly well-maintained and perfect for a growing family. The inspection went smoothly. The appraisal came in exactly at the purchase price, and the ISI loan process was way less scary than we expected, she said, thanks to having someone who could explain what all the paperwork meant. Brandon joined us, looking more confident and settled than I'd seen him in years. Home ownership seemed to have given him a sense of stability that had been missing during his period of uncertain employment. We want to do something to thank you for the down payment gift, he said. Michelle has an idea for paying it forward that we think you'll like. Michelle pulled out a folder from her purse. We've been documenting everything about the home buying process, the timeline, the costs, the paperwork, all the things we wish we'd known beforehand. We're thinking about creating a guide for other family members who want to buy homes. The idea was exactly what I'd hoped would happen when we'd structured their assistance as an investment in family financial literacy rather than a simple loan. That's brilliant, I said. What would the guide include? Everything from checking your credit score to understanding mortgage terms to budgeting for closing costs, Brandon replied. Plus contact information for the professionals who were helpful. The mortgage broker, the real estate agent, the inspector. And we want to offer to walk through the process with anyone in the family who's interested, Michelle added. Like you did for us, but for people who might be at earlier stages of preparation. Their enthusiasm was infectious. They'd gone from feeling intimidated by home ownership to wanting to help others navigate the same process, creating exactly the kind of knowledge-sharing cycle that could benefit the entire extended family. I think that's a wonderful way to pay it forward, I said. Have you talked to any of the cousins about their housing situations? Actually, yes, Michelle replied. Rosa has been renting the same apartment for 5 years and paying way too much for what she gets. And Miguel, Elena's Miguel, not the toddler, just graduated college and is living with his parents while he saves money. These were the kinds of individual situations that could benefit from informed guidance and family support. Rosa probably qualified for home ownership, but didn't know how to get started. Miguel could potentially skip years of rent payments if he understood available first-time buyer programs. What if we organized a family financial planning workshop? I suggested. Nothing formal, just a Saturday afternoon where people could ask questions about mortgages, real estate investing, budgeting, whatever they're curious about. David looked up from his smoke detector installation. I could help with that. Maybe create some simple spreadsheets for calculating mortgage payments and comparing rent versus buy scenarios. Uncle Roberto had stopped working on the blinds and was listening with obvious interest. You know, there might be neighbors who would benefit from something like that too. Not everyone has family members who understand these things. The suggestion expanded the scope from family education to community outreach, which appealed to me even more than the original idea. If we could help neighborhood residents make better housing decisions, we'd be addressing some of the same problems that had allowed Marcus Torres to exploit vulnerable tenants. We could host it here, I said, gesturing around the community room. It's designed for exactly this kind of gathering. Elena arrived as we were discussing potential topics for the workshop, carrying Miguel and looking harried but happy. Their move to the new house had gone smoothly, but the process of settling in was keeping them busy. Sorry I'm late. The cable installer took forever, and Miguel decided to hide all the outlet covers while I was signing paperwork. She set her son down, and he immediately toddled over to investigate Coco, who accepted the attention with patient dignity. Perfect timing, I said. We're planning a family financial planning workshop. Want to share your home selling and buying experience? Elena's face lit up. I'd love to. There were so many things I didn't know about selling a house, like how to price it competitively without leaving money on the table, or what repairs to make beforehand and what to leave for the buyers. And we could talk about how to handle financial emergencies without losing your home, she continued. That hardship forbearance program saved us when Miguel needed those medical treatments. The conversation continued for another hour, with everyone contributing ideas for workshop topics and potential presenters. By the time we finished, we'd outlined a comprehensive program covering everything from basic budgeting to real estate investment strategies. Mrs. Vasquez had been listening quietly while playing with Coco and Miguel. Finally, she spoke up. This is exactly what this neighborhood needs. Too many people get taken advantage of because they don't understand their options. What do you mean? I asked. My friend Mrs. Garcia just got evicted because her landlord said she was behind on rent, but she thinks he was stealing her payments. She didn't know how to prove she'd paid or what rights she had as a tenant. That's awful, Elena said. Could something like our workshop have helped her? Maybe. If she'd known to keep better records or known who to call when she had problems with her landlord, things might have been different. The story reinforced my commitment to the community outreach aspect of our planned workshop. Financial literacy and housing education weren't just nice ideas. They were practical tools that could protect people from exploitation and help them build better lives. As the afternoon wound down and family members began heading home, I found myself alone in the community room with David. We stood by the window overlooking the courtyard, where several children were playing while their parents chatted on benches we'd installed the month before. "It's amazing how much has changed," David said, echoing thoughts I'd been having all day. "What do you mean?" 6 months ago, your family barely knew what you did for work. Now they're planning to teach financial literacy workshops and helping each other buy houses. He was right. The transformation had been gradual but profound. My family had gone from seeing my success as something that separated me from them to seeing it as a resource that could benefit everyone. More importantly, they'd started building their own expertise rather than just depending on mine. "And 6 months ago, you were working weekends doing engineering consulting," I replied. "Now you're installing smoke detectors and calculating mortgage scenarios." David laughed. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I think I want to get my real estate license and work with you full-time." The suggestion surprised me, though I realized it shouldn't have. He'd been increasingly involved in every aspect of my business, from property research to tenant communications to financial analysis. "Are you sure? Real estate can be unpredictable compared to engineering work." "I'm sure. I love the problem-solving aspects, the community building, the chance to help people improve their housing situations. And working with you every day instead of just evenings and weekends would be amazing." The idea of formally partnering with David in business as well as life felt both exciting and natural. We'd already been functioning as a team. Making it official would just recognize what had already evolved. "We'd need to figure out the business structure, profit sharing, division of responsibilities," I said. "Of course. But Jessica, I think we could build something really special together. Not just a successful real estate business, but a model for how property investment can strengthen communities instead of displacing them." His vision aligned perfectly with what I'd been discovering about my own goals over the past few months. Financial success was important, but using that success to create opportunities for others was what gave the work meaning. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Your father and I are very proud of what you've accomplished. Not just the business success, but the way you're helping family and community. That's the kind of legacy that matters." The message brought tears to my eyes. For most of my life, I'd felt like my parents' disappointment. The daughter who was too ambitious, too focused on money, too different from what they'd expected. Now they saw my work as an expression of family values rather than a rejection of them. I showed the text to David, who smiled. "They've been bragging about you to anyone who will listen. Your dad told my parents last week that you're not just successful, you're successful in the right way." "What does that mean?" "Success that helps other people succeed too, instead of success that requires other people to fail." The distinction captured something important about the choices I'd made over the past year. I could have maximized short-term profits by charging higher rents, avoiding expensive improvements, and treating tenants as replaceable sources of income. Instead, I'd chosen to build long-term value through quality properties, fair rents, and genuine relationships with the people who lived in my buildings. As we locked up the community room and headed to our car, I thought about the various projects and commitments that would occupy the coming months. The tenant relocation assistance program was ongoing, with several families still needing permanent housing solutions. The financial literacy workshop required planning and coordination with community organizations. The task force on rental property fraud would involve meetings and policy development. Each responsibility represented an opportunity to expand the positive impact of my business success while building stronger connections with family and community. The work would be demanding, but it felt sustainable in a way that pure profit maximization never had. "David," I said as we drove home through the familiar streets of Maple Grove, "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Rodriguez said at that first barbecue." "Which part?" "When she introduced me as the one who bought the block." Bosa at the time, it felt like she was just identifying me as a property owner. But I think she was really saying something about belonging, about being invested in the neighborhood's future. You are invested in the neighborhood's future. But it's more than that. I'm not just someone who happens to own property here. I'm someone who grew up here, whose family still lives here, who cares about what happens to the people and places that shaped me. The roots made all the difference. I wasn't an outside investor extracting profits from a community I'd never see again. I was a community member with the resources and knowledge to address local housing challenges while building sustainable financial returns. "That's what makes your approach work," David said. "You understand the people and the neighborhood because you're part of both." As we pulled into our apartment complex, I noticed a "for sale" sign in front of the building next door. It was a small complex similar to several of my current properties, and I found myself automatically calculating potential purchase prices and improvement costs. "Thinking about expanding again?" David asked, following my gaze. "Always," I admitted. "But carefully. I want to make sure I can maintain the same level of attention and care for tenants as the portfolio grows. What would be the right size?" I considered the question as we walked upstairs. How many properties could I manage while still maintaining personal relationships with tenants? How large could the business grow before it stopped feeling like community building and started feeling like corporate operation? "I don't know yet," I said finally, "but I think the answer isn't about a specific number of properties. It's about whether I can still treat each tenant like Mrs. Vasquez or Carlos's family, like real people with individual needs and circumstances, rather than just sources of rent revenue. That's a good metric for measuring growth." Inside our apartment, I made tea while David pulled out his laptop to research real estate licensing requirements. The familiar evening routine felt different, knowing we might soon be working together full-time, building something larger than what either of us could accomplish individually. My phone rang with a call from Elena. "Jessica, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for our family this year." "You don't need to thank me. We're family." "That's just it. We are family, but for most of our lives that didn't mean much beyond showing up to the same holiday dinners. Now it feels like we're actually supporting each other's success." She was right. The traditional family obligation to attend events and exchange gifts had evolved into something more meaningful, genuine mutual aid based on individual strengths and resources. "I've been thinking about that financial workshop idea," Elena continued. "What if we made it a regular thing, like quarterly workshops covering different topics, depending on what people need to learn?" "I love that idea. We could track families' progress over time, celebrate successes, help people adjust when circumstances change." "Exactly. And Jessica, I think this could be a model for other families too. Imagine if everyone had relatives who understood mortgages and real estate and budgeting." The vision was ambitious but achievable. If our family could transform financial literacy from individual struggle to collective strength, other families could do the same. The workshop concept could become a template for community-based financial education. "Let's start with our own family and neighbors," I said. "If it works well, we can think about expanding the model." Agreed. "Oh, and one more thing. Miguel's preschool teacher asked if you'd be willing to speak to parents about affordable homeownership programs. Apparently, several families are interested, but don't know where to start." The invitation represented another opportunity to share knowledge while building community connections. It also suggested that my reputation for helping people with housing decisions was spreading beyond my immediate family and tenant base. I'd be happy to do that. Let me know when they want to schedule it. After hanging up, I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by the ordinary details of evening life. David's laptop, my teacup, bills to review, weekend plans to discuss. Nothing dramatic or glamorous, but deeply satisfying in a way that my earlier success had never been. 6 months ago, I'd measured achievement by financial independence and professional recognition. Those things were still important, but they'd become tools for something larger: the ability to contribute meaningfully to other people's success while building the kind of community I wanted to live in. The fraudulent Torres Property Management had tried to exploit my success by stealing my identity and reputation. Instead, they'd inadvertently created opportunities for me to prove my integrity publicly, strengthen relationships with family and tenants, and connect with city officials and community organizations working on similar goals. Sometimes the best response to people who try to tear you down is simply to keep building up yourself, your community, and the people who matter to you. Success that can withstand attacks is success that's rooted in genuine relationships and shared values rather than just individual achievement. David looked up from his laptop. Real estate licensing class starts next month. Should I register? Absolutely, I said, reaching for his hand across the table. Let's build something amazing together. Outside our window, the lights of Maple Grove twinkled in the desert evening. Somewhere in that neighborhood were the Paloma Apartments tenants settling into their evening routines, Elena's family unpacking boxes in their new house, Brandon and Michelle planning their future in their first home, and dozens of other families whose lives intersected with mine through the properties I owned and the community we all shared. The view looked the same as it had 6 months earlier, but everything about my place in it had changed. I was no longer the Torres daughter who worked downtown and kept to herself. I was Jessica Torres, landlord, neighbor, family member, and community builder, the one who bought the block and made it better for everyone who lived there. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.